All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to WatchThis with RickRamos. It is a pleasure to be here with you this Saturday afternoon recording. Here we are starting out the month of September, and we're going to do a little bit of an extension going into the great horror film. We're starting off our Halloween season, basically, and what we want to start off with is one of the great horror comedies, probably the greatest horror comedy ever filmed, ever made. Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. Just sitting down and watching it again after all these years. I haven't seen it in about 2 or 3 years now. It's a very comforting watch. It's a very comforting and soulful thing to just go back to seeing something that you fell in love with so many years ago, and to see how it continues. The magic of a movie watching experience just continues to give to you. I was thrilled to sit down and watch it again. The great performances, the great cinematography, Brooks's direction, Gene Wilder and Brooks's writing. I remembered why I love this film so much. So let's just jump into the episode, talk about this, what I consider Mel Brooks's masterpiece, and welcome our co-host, Mr. Ibrahim Chavez. Mr. Chavez, what is the standard question that I tend to go with on this kind of thing? What's your relationship with the film?
It's my relationship with the film is it's kind of you. I remember when we did Anthony Bourdain. We
Mm-hmm.
did at this point we've done two sessions or whatever. We did the first time, I guess shortly after his death, and then a year later. You described your relationship to the Bourdain phenomenon as kind of being late to that party.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I'm super late to this party because it wasn't until a few years ago that I saw this film. You let me borrow it, and
Mm-hmm.
being the person that I am, I still have it.
Yeah.
And it
Well,
was
that's
my
my gift
intention
to
to,
you. That's
yes, thank you, to send it to you.
yeah.
But I was like, well, I know he has another fucking
Actually, I have two copies of it.
copy. Yeah. Um, but so it's I hadn't seen this film up until fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
And so watching it for this, it's just there's something about it that makes me kind of marvel at it,
Yeah.
because I'm not really like into comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, and this is also
and
the
what I
broadest of comedy. This is, well, I
right.
guess Zucker, even Zucker would be the broadest of comedy, but there's something very vaudeville burlesque, kind of
Well, that
corny in a way about what Mel Brooks
yeah.
does. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing is that it's kind of like there's that. I mean, we're gonna get into all of it, but
Mm-hmm.
there's that. But it's a love letter to Universal horror. It's a love
Mm-hmm.
letter to old Hollywood with those vaudevillian tones. Um, and so that the mix of all of those things, the mix of that type of comedy, but also the horror as the foundation. Um, it's kind of this mixture of all of these different things. Um, and so I look at it, and everyone involved in this film. The end result makes it look like they made it easy,
Mm-hmm.
and they had fun making it look easy. But I'm like, how did they get it to look so good? And obviously, you say that every time you see a beautiful film,
Yeah.
a beautiful looking film, right? Um, but you watch this film, I watch this film, and you know that you're watching a masterwork, even if it's pretending to not take itself seriously. And that kind of that a lot of times, for example, I like shit that is serious and takes itself seriously,
Yeah.
as it should.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's interesting what it does. I mean, what it does to me is when I see something that's serious, but it's not serious because it's not, but it still is, and it's still dealing with these themes, but it's still a masterwork. But it looks like something that's serious. Um, it's all of these. It's more complex, and so there's a simplicity to it, but it's also like an elegant simplicity. So that's my relationship to it. It's kind of like I sit back and watch it, and it makes me it's one of the films that makes me ask, like, man, how did they do this? How did they get it to all come together like this? And obviously, look, every fucking film, we've talked about this, every film that gets made is a testament to coming together and making some shit out of nothing. But every once in a while, you get those classics that are kind of greater than the sum of their parts, and this is one of them.
Oh yeah. I think one of the things that, and you watch movies as you get older, you start to progress in your understanding. If you are a consummate movie watcher, or somebody who appreciates art, just art in general, what you find yourself doing is examining the beauty and the professionalism of a production, whether it be a play, a performance of some kind, writing, music, uh, painting, whatever. There is a certain level of professionalism that needs to be involved in order to sell an aesthetic. Now, with something like this, you have a history of films from, let's say, Dracula was 1930, right? 30?
30, 31,
30,
something like that.
31. So, Dracula, the
Todd
birth.
Browning's, you mean?
Yeah, Todd Browning's Dracula, the Bela Lugosi classic. We That sets up the template of the films that would come, that would follow. And we've talked about how important Lugosi was. Like, whatever you want to say about Christopher Lee or Chris Sarandon or anybody who has played a vampire or Dracula himself, everything comes out of Lugosi's interpretation. There's there was the sexiness, there was the vibe of that, but there was also the look, the cinematography, the grandness of whatever castle the vampire or the mad scientist or whoever. It creates this aesthetic. Some unknown country in Eastern Europe, Romania, Transylvania, the mountains of Austria or Germany, whatever.
Yeah,
This
the
is the world.
Carpathian Mountains,
The
right?
Carpathian Mountains, exactly. This is the world that is created by the Universal Studios vision of Bram Stoker's classic, Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley's her book Frankenstein or the modern day Prometheus, and then would later find itself in a totally fabricated storyline, The Wolfman, into The Mummy, and all the classic Universal stuff. That being said, why do I go to lengths to that? It's not just to be an egotistical prick showing how much I know of this or remember of it. What
No,
it's
this is knowledge.
no, and yeah, this is what I'm saying is Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder, in particular, director, writer, and Gene Wilder being the writer, have this wealth of a foundation to jump off of. So although this film is made in 1974 and it's set in 1974, everything about it feels like the 1930s films of James Wales, Todd Browning, and Leo McCrary, I think maybe did. I'm not really sure who did The Wolfman, but those films. And this film is in a way, it's a love letter to those Universal films, while at the same time making a somewhat contemporary handling of the material. I mean, when you let's just get this right out of the way. This entire film rises to vulgarity on the Mel Brooks level. That's it. Somebody, I think there was a time when he was doing the producers, and a woman said this movie is vulgar, and Brooks laughingly said this movie rises to the level of vulgarity.
Nice.
These Brooks,
nice
right?
erection joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all this film is. This film is a big dick joke. The introduction of a creature so large in order to facilitate the operation and the necessary biological needs that would allow Frederick Frankenstein to bring his creature to life. Larger veins, larger arms, legs, chest, head, and an enormous Schwanzstücke. First dick joke.
Yeah.
Madeline Khan being seduced by Peter Boyle as the creature. Woof. And then later, what did Dr. Frankenstein, by this time Frankenstein, get from the creature? And you hear Teri Garr struggling as he sticks it in. It ends on a dick joke. It's one big dick joke. It is so vulgar and crass and low character, and yet it's still within the appreciation and the beauty of the original 1931 Frankenstein film, 1935 Bride of Frankenstein film, and then the two other films that would follow, including, because this film is based on the first four films, and a little bit of Frankenstein meets Dracula. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman.
Wolf, right?
Yeah.
Wolfman, yeah.
So Frankenstein 31, Bride of Frankenstein 35, Son of Frankenstein 39, and The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942. And I think Ghost of Frankenstein is where Basil Rathbone takes on the role of Victor Frankenstein, or the son, the great-grandson of Frankenstein. And you see a lot of, if you've watched those films, the template is Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. You have the scene where you have the basic idea, the basic setup, the creation scene,
right.
the laboratory, you have the little girl thrown into the lake. You have the townspeople rioting, and then you have obviously the Bride of Frankenstein and the hermit in Bride of Frankenstein. But then the character that Gene Wilder plays, Frederick Frankenstein, that is very much in keeping with what Basil Rathbone did in
with the son.
Yes, I'm not sure if it was Son of Frankenstein or Ghost of Frankenstein. Yes, it was Son of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein.
Because that's the one where Bela Lugosi plays.
No, Bela Lugosi plays Igor in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. in Son of Frankenstein, is Bella in that? He might be. It's hard to keep track of where Bella Lugosi
Yeah, because
was.
it's like Igor, and then it's Fritz, and
That's
well,
right.
first I think it was Fritz,
It was
and then
Fritz.
it's Igor, and yeah, it's
Hmm.
they kind of these stories blend.
They do.
Um,
They do. They absolutely do. So yeah, it's Son of Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi as Igor, who would be Marty Feldman's father or grandfather. Yeah, grandfather. That was the last time that Karloff would play the creature. And then you have the Ghost of Frankenstein, where I'm not sure. Is it? I think it's Lon Chaney Jr. playing the creature. Bela Lugosi returning as Bela Lugosi returning as Igor. And then you have the character of the character that Kenneth Mars parallels. You know the character that I'm talking about? The
the
chief,
the cop.
the cop.
Yeah,
So you have this character with a wooden arm, and in the original film, it's the creature had ripped off his arm. That's how it was explained in Ghost of Frankenstein. So you have this history, you have this multi-layered history, and it's even referenced in Young Frankenstein. There's a scene where the men, the townspeople, the male townspeople are meeting, and they're talking about the potential danger of Frankenstein coming back to the village, and they're all alike. It's in a Frankenstein's blood. This is what he does, and they say, you do not need to tell us who have lived through this 5 times before. Well, they're talking about the five
right.
films. They're talking about
Yeah,
those 5 films, and it's a subtle little joke. It's a funny little joke. This it's very strange that this film. What's great is that Gene Wilder had the sense enough to rein Mel Brooks in. Because I could see that Mel Brooks would have played Igor, or he would have, because Mel Brooks almost always was in all of his films. After The Producers, I think he was in every film that he directed, playing in some role. But Gene Wilder said, "You have a tendency to wink at the camera. I want to maintain this as close to the Universal films as we want. You cannot be in this film. It would destroy the beauty of it." And Brooks was not offended by it. He agreed with them, so they made the film in that way. They adhere to the mythology and the history of Frankenstein. And I think that's one of the things that makes, when you talk about how beautifully a film is crafted and how you want to know how they were able to, because the sense that I'm getting of what you say, and I agree with it, is not so much that it's simply beautiful, the cinematography works. How is it such a funny and compelling movie watching experience? And I think that is because there is a respect and a love for the original films.
yeah, a reverence.
A reverence. They do not in any way dishonor it. And there's a lot of ways that it could have went sideways here. The dick jokes, the putting on the Ritz number, the blind man scene. It's broad comedy, yes, but it's in keeping with a story that is ultimately a beautiful one. It's a story of creation. And it expands on the original James Whale, the first 2 James Whale films. When we watched Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, I remember neither of us caring for the Bride of Frankenstein as much. As I've gone back to
Right.
watch Bride of Frankenstein, it has grown in my respect. I still prefer Frankenstein, but I understand why so much of The Bride of Frankenstein is good, and it's because the character evolves with Karloff's second portrayal. He speaks a little bit. He talks about what bothers him. He wants companion. There's a loneliness. There's a
Yeah.
sadness to the creature in Bride of Frankenstein that isn't there in the original Frankenstein film. He's a monster. You don't.
Right.
He's like a dog. He's like a vicious dog that you don't like to be. You don't like to watch being mistreated or abused. But at the end of the day, you also know that he's dangerous. Brooks and
And then
Wilder.
you,
Go ahead.
sorry, and then you add the element of the bride now.
Yes. Yes.
And it's she's not she's like, well, okay, what the fuck? She's now in this existentialist moment, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
she's like, well, I exist. What's happening? And they're like, well, you belong to him. You're for him, basically. And she's like, fuck no, I'm not into this. What the fuck? Um, and and you see that, and it just adds. It's all about kind of like it's easy for in the first one to get caught up in in the story and for it to be okay. The main theme is what is it to be alive?
Yeah.
To technology, medicine, science, is it going too far? All of that, right? It's the first like sci-fi novel, or if not the first, one of the first, whatever. And by the time you get to the second one, now you can expand on those themes, and it's carried over from the first one, the modern Prometheus. It's now the idea of fire, and fire is bad. No, fire is good. This person is learning in the films. He's learning to distinguish on a deeper level versus just good, bad.
Yeah.
And now there's context. Okay, in this context, this thing can have a positive outcome. He's learning to weigh the benefits versus the minuses. He's gaining more personhood, more of an identity, because he's learning what he likes. Then, like you described, there's this longing for a companion. There's that Adam moment, right?
Yeah.
And then he gets his Eve, but she's just not, it's not her choice. And so she's like, no, fuck this. And then he freaks the fuck out. And all hell breaks loose, and that's why I jokingly, not jokingly, described him as the first, if not one of the first incels. Because, like, how do you handle rejection, like, at that level of maturity?
Yeah. You break things up. You cry. You get angry.
It's a tantrum, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's destructive. It's like completely destructive because he has the capability and the power to do that. And you can have these like social statements without necessarily getting on a soapbox, you know what I mean? And without saying, well, of course, I'm a liberal or whatever the fuck, right?
Yeah.
And and the opposite soapbox. So to play with those things, and then now you have in the 70s people revisiting this in a way that's the delicate balance, is because it honors it, but at the same time it makes fun of it.
Yeah.
And the that day, I think of that decade. I mean, it's about smashing the idols and all that stuff, musically, all this different shit. Um, there, they could have you hit it on the head when you described how it could have gone so-called wrong,
Yeah.
because look at the Kenneth Branagh.
Hmm.
We talked about it.
Yeah.
Kenneth Branagh decided to make his love letter to that story, like this modern adaptation that was kind of like in the wannabe in the style of fucking Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, but it fell flat because it just didn't come together, and it was too much Kenneth Branagh.
Yeah. Way too much.
Whereas you're describing Gene Wilder as telling Mel Brooks, no, like remove yourself from that aspect.
Hmm.
Focus on this. Not to fucking beat a dead Frankenstein's monster's corpse, but fucking Tarantino. Imagine had Tarantino done this, he would have been in it. He would have. You can see how he'll fuck it up.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because certain people can do something and you'll say that's fucking disrespectful. Fuck that. People said that when Tarantino did the Bruce Lee stunt, the Bruce Lee fight in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Hmm.
There's something about it. Because that's one of these issues is like, to me, there's one of these issues is like, you can do anything, and I encourage rebellion. You know what I mean? Like in the arts, and I encourage the smashing of the idols in the arts. That's what it's for. Even in the smashing of the idols, there's on some level there's some kind of respect for that. Punk rock music in the 70s, and I'm all over the place, but I don't care. Punk rock music in the 70s was a rejection in many ways of what has been described as the bloated fucking like Led Zeppelin stadium rock, half an hour guitar solo, then the drum solo while everyone's getting a blowjob in the backstage, and while they were doing all this and that, what were they doing? What did while the big rock bands, stadium rock bands were doing all of that, and then the punk bands come in, the Ramones, what are they doing? They're going back to fucking like early rock and roll and doo-wop. 3-minute songs. So that while they're smashing the idols that came before them, they're still positioning themselves in the tradition of rock and roll. They're still aligning themselves with something. So it's a balance to be able to, on the one hand, mock something, but while you're still not even mocking it, but you're making fun of it, you're satirizing it,
Hmm.
but at the same time it's kind of like you're not forgetting. It's an homage and a send up.
Yeah.
And I think when something, whatever kind of project that is, when something does it right, and that's the thing, I don't know what right is, but we feel it. That's what becomes kind of like a cult classic.
Sure.
And I think, for example, Basic Instinct, I think there's a lot of satire in it. I don't think it does enough to make it this so-called successful satire plus homage, but it's a cult classic. It's not enough, maybe. Something like this is the perfect fucking balance of all of those opposing elements. That's what really like gets me about this film, is that it's a blend of opposites. That's what it is. And it's done so well that there's a part of you that says this shouldn't be this perfectly balanced, but it is. And that also gets at a deeper layer, is like, because it's not scary. But I was talking to someone at work yesterday, and I'm like, well, but how much of horror is actually like scary, especially nowadays, that having been through, at this point in history, we've seen it all.
Yeah.
Basically. But horror and comedy, that it has the look of horror, but it's a comedy. And as we go on next year, next month, next year, and so on, we'll get more into comedies. But why are there so many horror comedies? Because, well, you run out of shit to say.
But it's also comedy and horror live next door to each other, because
yes,
there is a fear
inside you.
Yeah. Like when you get scared and you jump, almost immediately you start laughing hysterically, because you're overwhelmed by how easy it is to control you in that situation, and how in that moment you lost control. In that moment you were genuinely afraid of something, and it really fucks with your head, and it makes you laugh, because it's a way of defaulting to what you know is not real. So it's like, oh shit,
And you release tension that way.
Yeah, you do.
We used to, I've probably said this before, but I took a clowning class. It was a physical theater class. To me, it was one of the greatest classes I ever took in my theater training. And we used to have to come in with, like, everyone would be off stage, or even if it was in a dance studio, you're just off to the side, and then, okay, one by one, he would call you to enter, and you'd stand right dead center, and everyone's watching you. And the exercise is, you're either going to laugh or you're going to cry. He's going to tell you. And this is not sense memory, all this shit where you're thinking about, your dead godparent who you love to pieces and all this bullshit. This is just cold. Just stand in the middle of the room, laugh. That's incredibly difficult. It's easier to cry. And to the non-theater person, it's like, well, they sound both incredibly difficult, and they are. But what you're doing is you're working from the outside in, and you just do it physically. And so it's easier to get to a place where you're making the sounds, it's connecting, you're getting the breath. And then the breath is kind of similar to laughing and crying. There are similarities, and then that will get a deeper response. So you start pretending basically to cry, and then eventually you start to get to that level, and he will allow you time to get to that level. Another thing we used to do is we used to all sit on the floor together, and we would go in waves. We would start 0, and then now, okay, everyone build up to crying, build up to laughing, and we're laughing, cry, and it's a muscle. And it's like you say, these things live next to each other. And now we're back in the 70s watching a thing about someone bringing someone back from the dead the way his grandfather did. And he doesn't want to, inherit the sins of the father, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But in the context of a dead body, there's sexuality and there's dick jokes,
Yeah.
and there's shit that we shouldn't supposedly be laughing at, but it's funny. Even in the most like basic stupid humor, it's kind of like you look at this movie and it's endearing to you. It's cute but not stupid.
No. Well, it's like there's like a lot of easy gags. There's what a revolting job, what a disgusting job. Oh, it could be worse. How could it be worse? It could be raining, and then boom, the thunder, the lightning hits. You see, that's a really obvious joke, but it's done with such it's done with such a respect for those type of jokes where it harkens back to the early days of cinema, the early days of the anarchy of the Marx Brothers, the ridiculousness of the Three Stooges, and that back and forth relationship of superiority versus the the dumb character versus the slightly less dumb character with Laurel and Hardy. I mean, there's when I watch this film, I look at it, and I've known it in the past, but watching it last night, I really got a respect for Brooks and Wilder and everybody else acting in it in their total commitment to the style
Hmm.
of performance. And because what I think it would have been a failure of a film if they were constantly winking at the camera. If they were and Marty Feldman breaks the fourth wall every once in a while, but it's also in
Yeah.
keeping. There's something about the way he does it that is very respectful of the material. This could have been a mess of a fucking movie. And if you want to see him, I mean, I haven't seen it in years, but Dracula Dead and Loving It, Mel Brooks's other horror parody and his last film, is miles away from this. Miles away from this. It has a couple of funny moments, but for the most part, you can tell that the master is no longer in control of the instrument. In this film, Mel Brooks is completely in control, but he also has Gene Wilder there for the assist. And I imagine there were moments when they would go at it. And there's a story that Gene Wilder would tell. There's a couple of stories, but Gene Wilder would tell this story that Brooks and he got into it at his apartment, and they were yelling and screaming at each other. Mel Brooks was throwing a tantrum, just pissed off, and stormed out of the apartment, left, just they were I don't know if they were motherfucking each other, but they were really going at it. 10 minutes later, Gene Wilder gets a phone call, and it's Mel Brooks, and Mel Brooks says, "What the hell is going on there? You had a crazy man in there screaming and yelling at you. Don't you know better than to have crazy people in your house? You cannot have crazy people like." And Gene Wilder said that was Mel Brooks's idea of apologizing. That was the closest that he would come
Yeah.
to that. And it was because there's Mel. I was lucky enough to see Mel Brooks live at the Egyptian Theater maybe 2 or 3 times. I saw him once by himself. I saw him once with Carl Reiner. Maybe I saw him one more time, but it was really something to watch someone perform in an interview. And usually I don't like that kind of thing. I don't like it when somebody is always on. It used to bug the shit out of me to watch Robin Williams in interviews, and then I thought it was just sad because I could tell
Yeah.
that there was a sadness there. There was a painful, and this was before his passing. I could tell that there was something there. Mel Brooks, you don't get that. Mel Brooks is just constantly on. His mission is to make you laugh, and there's, I think, most people who know comedy would say they're the top 10 greatest funny people in the world, and Mel Brooks would probably be in that top 10, if not in that top 5. And this film, I think, is probably the greatest the greatest showcasing and simultaneous showcase and restraint of his comedy talent. Brooks himself said this is the best thing that he ever did, although it's not the funniest thing he ever did. Blazing Saddles is much funnier than this. But Blazing Saddles, which is also dealing with a genre,
Yeah.
but it's also a broader, because it's not a specific film within that genre. It's more of the genre as a template to jump off of. Blazing Saddles is a more ribald, in your face, I would argue obnoxious film. This is a much more loving and respectful look at those early films. And even though they definitely have things that would challenge 1930s sensibilities and 1930s and 40s audiences, they fit beautifully in the 1970s. The level of sexual humor, which are rampant throughout Brooks's work, just the adultery, Gene Wilder's sleeping with his assistant, his relationship with Madeline Khan, but it's all played with a certain level of, they're coloring within the lines. I guess is the best way that I can say it, is that they give themselves a little bit of leeway, but it's still fundamentally, it adheres to the template created by the Wales, the first two Wales films, and then the next two films, and the aesthetic. And I think because it looks like one of those films, it really does look like it could have been made. Let's see, Ghost of Frankenstein was 45, I think. This looks like it could have been made in 49, 50, somewhere around there, because it is in keeping with that look. And Mel Brooks was very smart, because he went into the meeting, he pitched this at Columbia. He wanted $2.3 million. They would only go as high as 1.75. He got them to agree, and then he said, "Oh, by the way, it's going to be black and white." And that's when they put their foot down. They said, "No, there's no fucking way." And Brooks tells this story about how, they told him that Peru just got color in their cinema, so and it was the beginning of that worldwide, where we got to sell it everywhere. And the money men have no respect for the aesthetic and the art of cinema. They have no respect. So a guy like Mel Brooks has to rage against the machine. He has to fight. And it was beautifully done. He moved over to 20th Century Fox with Alan Ladd Jr., I think. He told them, "We want 2.3. And we want to shoot it in black and white." And they said, "Yeah, do it." But he stuck. He knew what would go into making it a success. That if it was going to succeed, it had to be in keeping with those earlier films. And I've always respected Mel Brooks. I've always held the utmost respect for Mel Brooks, because as ridiculous as he is, as wacky as he is, as obnoxious, as in your face and always going for the joke, he has a respect for the craft. He is a great director, and he's a great director even when he's simply a producer. There's a story, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but he hired David Lynch to do The Elephant Man. The Elephant Man is a Mel Brooks film. You know that, right?
I knew that. I don't know the backstory, but I know that he gave Lynch his shot.
Basically, Lynch had spent 7 or 8 years making Eraserhead at the American Cinematheque. Brooks saw it fell in love with that picture and offered him The Elephant Man. So there was questions. That was 80, 81. It was black and white. It had this very strange aesthetic to it. It's a very disturbing and discomforting film. It's as I've and you also remember, this is the critical analysis, the public analysis of it, but also my 6-7 year old viewing of it. The Elephant Man is a film that has scared the shit out of me for probably the first 20 years of my life. When I first saw it, at 6-7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And Lynch was forced to show it to the producers who were not understanding of what he was trying to do, who did not appreciate what he was putting on the screen. Brooks, as the producer, showed them. They began to give him notes with David Lynch there. And Mel Brooks looked at him and said, "Wait a minute, stop." He said, "We screened the film for you to bring you up to date. Do not misconstrue this as our soliciting the input of raging primitives." Mm-hmm. Then he grabbed David Lynch and they walked out of the room. That's an artist. That's somebody who has a certain level of power and does not abuse it, but uses it in service to the art. It could have been very easy for him to get a large budget and shoot it in color and make it look like one of the Hammer films, but the film would not have worked. The film absolutely would have fallen flat because nobody would. And like, I can show this movie to my nephew right now, who's 16 years old, and he will get it. And part of that is because the early films, the Universal films, even though my nephew hasn't seen those films, he's seen stills of those films, he's seen clips from those films, they've played out in other films. There is a certain aesthetic that sinks itself into a movie watcher's subconscious that arises when you watch this. It is film culture, and it is part of our culture. So when you're watching, every note hits. All I can say about this, there's so much I can say about this film, and there's so much that I want to say about this film. But, last week we did Billy Friedkin's Killer Joe, and you said that was a perfect cast. And you were right. Yeah. You were absolutely right. There is not a single false note. Nobody plays it badly. Nobody drops or fumbles anything. Every scene, every performance hits. This film exceeds that. This probably, for me, is the greatest ensemble cast ever put on film. Everybody in it is on point. And as I watch it, every time I watch it, and I've seen this film upwards of 25, 30 times now. The film is almost 50 years old. Right? Yeah, it's almost 50 years old.
Yeah, it's 74, right?
Yeah, it's 74. It'll be in next year. It'll the end of next year, probably December of next year. It'll be 50 years old. I have gone back and forth with who I love more in this film. There was a point where originally I fell in love with Madeline Khan. Madeline Khan. And she's such a horrible character in this film, but you love her. You love Madeline Khan. I don't know how familiar you are with Madeline Khan's work.
Not very much.
She was an incredible talent, a beautiful woman, beautiful voice. That's her singing on the soundtrack. "Oh, Sweet Mystery of Life, At Last I Found You," and the Battle Hymn of the Brothers. She's fucking great, right? But she's also the Marlene Dietrich character in Blazing Saddles, Lily von Stoop. I fell in love with her right away. Not only beautiful, great legs, great rack, but funny. Incredibly funny. And to watch her play that out with with Gene Wilder. And then to see how she is so base when the creature kidnaps her. I don't know of another actress who could have sold that scene as well. Where she's lying there and she's like, "What do you want? What do you need? My father is a very rich man, and speak, damn it, speak." And then she's just looking at him and she's like, "Oh, you can't be serious." And she sees the dick. That moment where she just looks at him and says, "Woof." I lose my mind every time I say that because it's so fucking ridiculous. It's so... And then later on, when you see the villagers come in, they're gonna riot, they're gonna lose their mind, and one more time, 7 has always been my lucky number, and he hears the music and well, you better not go off and tell all of your friends. Like, oh my god, I think I love him. She fucking makes me gut laugh every time I see that scene. It's ridiculous. It's just it's on another level of. She hits every note. And originally, she was supposed to play the Inga character. She was going to play the assistant, but she changed her mind and she wanted the Elizabeth character, which Teri Garr had already won that part. So Teri Garr, which this is her first real film. It was her first. She had done background work. She had been a go-go dancer in a couple of movies, but she had never done anything on this level. And Gene Wilder had discovered her, saw her. They put her in this film. When she had the role of Elizabeth, they gave it to Madeline Khan. Brooks said, "Well, if you want, you can come back tomorrow and audition with a German accent." And the story is, Teri Garr says that she used to work on the Sonny and Cher show. Cher's wig mistress, her makeup woman, was a German woman. She just mimicked that accent, came back, and boom. And I think she's fantastic because she has a level of innocence, but also sultriness that is not overpowering. But she's beautiful and sexy in this movie, and just you understand. The naivety plays into the role, while at the same time she's very aware of her sexuality. What knockers? Oh, thank you, doctor. It's just, there's moments and that's a cheap joke. That's just a cheap, shitty little joke, but it works. So, each character I can go into. Peter Boyle is the creature, and he has so little to do in the beginning, but he imbues the character with, he follows the Karloff, But then but as with Karloff, you can see the humanity in his eyes. And my favorite scene in the entire movie is when they've recaptured him, they've sedated him, he's in the library chained, and Gene Wilder comes in to win him over. You know the scene I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And he's the monster awakens, Gene freaks out, he wants to be let out, I'll stomp your fucking heads in, And then he turns around and he's like, hey, you good looking, and he gives him that whole, you talk about the Olympic ideal. I mean, I know this film back and forth in my heart. I'm not getting the exact wording right, but when he looks at me and says, "This is a good boy. This is a nice boy. This is a mother's angel." I still, to this day, grab my nephew and I do that. And he hates it. But it's just me making myself laugh because of this movie. And as Peter Boyle breaks down because he knows that he's loved, that he's cared for, that he's not just some creature, it gives power to the later scenes and his struggle. I think it's magnificent. I think it's a fantastic scene, and it makes the putting on the Ritz scene, which should not work. That scene should be so fucking ridiculously over the top that Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder should be ashamed that they included it. But it works beautifully. It worked, especially that moment where Gene Wilder puts the treat in Peter Boyle's mouth as if he were a dog. I love that. There's shit like that just Marty Feldman, Gene Wilder, Cloris Leachman is incredible. She's just amazing in this film. Frau Blucher, and then the horse whinnying, which they do that joke one last time after she's releasing the creature. And you still get the big laugh because you're not prepared for it at that point. All of it hits.
Right.
But I think the understated, not understated because it's a very broad and very in-your-face performance, but I think the unheralded performance in this film is Kenneth Mars. Kenneth Mars as the constable. I think the way he is committed to the ridiculousness of that fake arm leaves me screaming. And I remember maybe 6 or 7 years ago was the first time that I noticed. I don't know how I ever missed it. It was the first time that I noticed that he had a monocle on the eye patch. The first time I saw that, I lost my mind. I thought, that's fucking hilarious. That's so stupid. That is so incredibly stupid. And but it's just everybody commits. Everybody from Gerald Hirschfeld, the cinematographer, to the set design, to bringing back Kenneth Strickfaden, who created all of the original equipment for the bringing to life, right? The laboratory. Yeah, he kept all of that stuff. He had it in his garage in Santa Monica. I don't know what made Mel Brooks think, let me find this guy. But he found, I think what he wanted to do was find the guy so that he could bring him on board to replicate it. And then he realized that the guy had all of that. So they paid him to come down to bring it. They trucked it all in. They set it all up. They created a few new gadgets. And it feels like the 31 film. It feels like the 35 film. There are moments that mirror that. When they're going to dig up Peter Boyle's body, Gene Wilder is crouching. Marty Feldman is just below him. Marty Feldman starts to rise. And Gene Wilder pushes him down and says, "Down, you fool." That's almost exactly the same as the first film. Down, you fool. I think it's great. I think if you had to pick out a scene, well, what's your favorite scene of the film? What's the one that makes you realize this is why it's a masterpiece?
It's the reenactment of and I want to get back into because I want to ask you about Gene Hackman. But
I'm so glad that this is the one that I'm so glad. Yeah. Let's talk about it.
and I'm giving you space to just gush,
which I will. Little Bill as the blind man.
I'm giving you space to just gush about the film, just kind of because it's cool. And then I want to talk about kind of how in Mel Brooks's filmography did we get to this film, and then the legacy, and then what came after. Mm-hmm. But so to answer your question, when it's the animation of the monster, mm-hmm. Which is that's it's alive. That's the moment that, or one of them that everyone knows from the Frankenstein story. But when you have this person who is very much not wanting to be, the reluctant main character, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't want to do it. doesn't want to be that person. I'm different. I'm not him. I'm not my grandfather.
Yeah.
Slowly becomes that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then embraces it to the level of, that line tonight, something along the lines of tonight, we shall, whatever, hurl the gauntlet of science
Yeah.
into the frightful face of death itself.
That mirrors a lot of what was in the original book.
But it's
Yeah.
beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
beyond just the kind of that homage to it. It's at that moment you're not watching a comedy anymore.
No.
At that moment you're not even watching horror anymore. At that moment you're just, we when we were doing that tennis match, and we're still going to get back to that, but we go off on our tangents.
Yeah.
We ended up talking about mad scientists, basically. And then we ended up talking about Oppenheimer. And ultimately, it's kind of like, well, that's kind of what it is to be a person, to be a human being, is to be that individual who, whether it's with fire or cooking or whatever the fuck it is trying to hurl the gauntlet of fill in the blank, whether it's science, technology, art, whatever, into the frightful face of death itself. And every time we watch a movie, whether it's about that or not, it is still about that, because the movie itself is this Mel Brooks, Scorsese, Coppola, Tarkovsky, Kurosawa, Tarantino, whatever. They're all throwing their thing into the frightful face of death. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yeah.
And that's the moment that it's the most, I think, universal, and it gets at the human condition, while at the same time it gets at that question of, like, how much of this hurling of science into the frightful face of death is it me wanting to do that, or is it because I've been led down this path? And he's so into it. He's committed to, and I don't just mean Gene Wilder's committed to it, but I mean the character is so committed to now committing the act, but also achieving the result. And is so single-minded about it that you're rooting for this scientist to bring a corpse back from the dead, knowing all the fucking ramifications. But because he's so into it that for a minute it's like, you lose the long view, and you're just like, yes, do it.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, like what that's the scary thing about fucking cinema, but it's the power of cinema, is that you can, look at that. Oppenheimer, we know what that means.
Yeah.
To achieve that splitting of the atom. But it's this accomplishment.
Yeah.
We know what it means to harness fire. We take it for granted. Whether we're turning the key on the car or lighting a candle, your stove, whatever the cigarette, whatever the fuck it is. Um, but you can see the images of whatever wildfire, whatever, whatever. Um, so that moment, because it's so loaded, and it really just kind of like it just took a turn. It just was this. It wasn't like being funny anymore at that point. It was fucking shit got real, and it went back to being funny, but it was just like that moment. That's my favorite moment.
They're coming to life.
Yeah.
It's beautifully done. I mean, anybody who says that Brooks is just a gag man, they're missing. They're really missing a lot of what it is that he did. He was a consummate professional. At the very least, maybe he had the short leash on him with Gene Wilder being there, but I think there was an understanding of what needed to be done. I think there was an understanding of how important the art is, and to do it right instead of to go for, um, um, you asked about the subsequent films. So you're talking about History of the World, Part One. You're talking about Spaceballs, Robin Hood Men in Tights, Life Stinks, and Dracula Dead and Loving It. I can't remember if there was To Be or Not to Be is in there. Oh, High Anxiety and Silent Movie. Those films didn't have the power that this one has because they were free for alls. There was almost no constraint. It was just like gag, 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 and they're fun for what they are. Spaceballs is a great time. A lot of funny shit in it, but also jokes that miss as oftentimes as they hit. It's just that when he hits very hard. Very funny shit in each one of those films. History of the World is still makes me laugh hysterically. And I remember watching the Spanish Inquisition scene going, what the fuck is this? And not understanding what the Spanish Inquisition was. You're just seeing this weird little musical number that is highly offensive. It is. Have you ever seen that?
What is this?
History of the World Part One,
I don't think so.
where he's going through different the Stone Age, caveman years. He's Moses at one point into
I think I've seen clips.
the
I don't
Rome.
think I've
Yeah.
seen the whole thing.
Well, he does a bit on the Spanish Inquisition, and it's a musical number. The Inquisition, watch out, sin the Inquisition. It's just fucking ridiculous. It's very offensive. It's very offensive. He plays Torquemada. And if you don't know anything about the Spanish Inquisition, it's just the church killing all these Jews, I guess. I don't know. That's another thing in this film. It's like the Jewish thing is played down, but it's still there. And I don't know if I'm the only one that ever noticed this, or if I'm reading too much into it. But with a Mel Brooks film, you're looking for that Jewish moment, and with him, Frankenstein. You get the Stein, right?
Yeah.
He wants to be known as Frankenstein.
Hmm.
So there's a little bit of self-hating Jew there, where he finally embraces it later on. I don't. It might be a stretch. I don't think it's too much of a stretch. I think it's
No.
part of his aesthetic, and I think it's just a little bit of a joke that he gets in there.
I mean, there's you can't get away from the specter
No.
of the Holocaust.
No.
I it's there's probably someone, maybe not someone who's listening to us, but there would be someone who probably wouldn't listen to us, would say, ah, here we fucking go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's like, watch a black film, and you can't get away from the specter of slavery. I don't give a fuck what you argue with me about. I don't give a fuck, not you, but
Yeah,
whoever.
I know what you mean.
It's like, no, fucking, like, realize this.
Yeah.
Person who isn't listening to this podcast, because everyone who listens to us fucking, like, has some level of awareness.
Yeah.
Because at this point, it's for the most part probably preaching to the choir. But, like, is it a fucking stretch that, like, you're talking about a mad scientist, that you're talking about intolerance in village life in Germany? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
this creature. I mean, horror and gothic horror has also been described as, like, you know, the fear of contagion, the fear of contamination, there's all of this shit going on. And the idea of, like, the Bride of Frankenstein is not that, you know, this moment of who am I and why do I belong to him, but I don't like it and blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is gothic horror. There are a lot of, you know, Mary Shelley is not, even in that period outside of horror. There are a lot of female authors dealing with those types of subjects.
Yeah.
And Radcliffe, you know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yeah.
Like, she's probably the big one. Horror, sci-fi, all that stuff. It's a cliche at this point to say that, well, these are talking about the ills of the day. You don't need to talk about something explicitly to talk about it. You don't even need to realize, and then this is probably, someone can argue and say, well, now you can insert whatever. Well, yes, you can. You don't even need to be aware of the shit that you're fucking bringing into it. This is why people who study things look and find themes.
Yeah.
The person creating it may not even be aware that that's what they were going for. Or they may say, look, I'm not fucking, like, I don't support that interpretation. They might say, hey, I can see that. I can see that you're seeing this in it, but that wasn't my intention. But if you say it is, they can either argue yes or no. That's on them. But I mean, that Mel Brooks has some kind of concept of ethnicity, race, and culture that he's, like, playing with. You know what I mean? Like, just because shit's left on the cutting room floor doesn't mean that the flavors don't get into the fucking.
Oh, yeah.
To mix metaphors there. You know what I mean? Like, Blazing Saddles is explicit in its playing of those themes. This, not so much, but it's explicit in other shit. You know what I mean? Like this is what I was gonna ask you is what's Mel Brooks, what's the short version of who is Mel Brooks and how did he get to make this film? How did he get here?
I think part of the thing is that Mel Brooks started off as basically a young writer on Sid Caesar's, your show of shows, Caesar's Hour, the Caesar Comedy Hour. So he was Sid Caesar's guy, basically. Him, and he was part of a writing team including Neil Simon, Carl Reiner, Larry Gelbart, later, much later, Woody Allen, and these guys. So he had made a name for himself as a writer, but also the wildest, craziest Jew bastard in the company. This is what he did, and he would just go to incredible extremes. There's a point where Sid Caesar hung him out a window because Sid Caesar was volatile. He was one of his best friends, but he was volatile at the same time. Sid Caesar actually punched the horse that gave Mel Brooks the idea to do it in Blazing Saddles. Sid Caesar actually punched a horse, so they had a relationship. They went far back. They in the early days of live television, which a lot of that doesn't exist anymore because they didn't record anything. It was all broadcast live and then kinetoscope, and that's a whole other bullshit. So much of early television is lost because they didn't have the forethought to save it. But then he would go and he would get money. He bamboozled somebody into getting the producers made. He would win an Academy Award for Best Screenplay, Best Original Screenplay for that film, and then do a couple of films that didn't really hit. I think he did The 12 Chairs that nobody really saw. It's him, Dom DeLuise, Frank Langella, set in Romania. It's a movie about jewels or something. I can't remember exactly. But then he would destroy all. He would create Get Smart. That's what it is. He created Get Smart with Buck Henry, and Get Smart was a parody of obviously 007, and then later like In Like Flint or My Man Flint or whatever. This would give him the cachet to get something done in the studios. He did Blazing Saddles, and he pulled Gene Wilder into that when none of the other actors. John Wayne didn't want to do it. Gig Young was going to do it at one point. Gig Young was a famous Western actor, but he was so far into the depths of alcoholism that they needed somebody, and they pulled Gene Wilder. And Gene Wilder doesn't really fit that world, but it's beautiful. Him and Cleavon Little. Anyway, the story, and those are stories for another day. That's a whole Blazing Saddles episode, which, you know, as volatile as that film is and as dangerous as that film is, because even now, that's a dangerous film, even more so now than it was back in '74 when it was made. But during the making of that film, Gene Wilder mentioned to Mel Brooks that he was working on this idea called Young Frankenstein, and Mel Brooks was like, "Oh, come on, there's been so many Frankensteins. There's Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, Cousin of Frankenstein, Son-in-Law." You know, he was going off on that whole thing. That was Mel Brooks, and Gene Wilder explained his idea of a young Frankenstein scientist who wanted nothing to do with the family. And Mel Brooks said, "That's a funny idea." And Mel Brooks at that point, because people were already losing their mind over how big Blazing Saddles was going to be. They were scared of it, but they also knew that it was going to be big. I think he had carte blanche to do what he wanted. With the power of Get Smart and Blazing Saddles, he was able to start making films. And when they moved this film from Columbia to 20th Century Fox, and it made $90 million on a $2 million budget, it set him up for the rest of his career. So that's why he was able to continue making movies into the early 90s. And that was Mel Brooks. I mean, comedy writer into a producer. He would produce The Elephant Man. He would produce 84 Charing Street. He would produce, I think he did Agnes of God maybe, but he did a number of films that he directed himself, but also that were put out under Crossing Delancey. I think he did. He did a number of films, and he became a powerhouse. And but also off the backs of this film and Blazing Saddles, he became the great Mel Brooks. He became the thing that we're still talking about 50 years later. You know, so that's, I mean, when he goes, it's going to be a very sad, sad day for comedy. Look, Hollywood loves success. Hollywood loves when something proves to be financially successful. And when he was able to do Blazing Saddles and take on race relations and get away with the shit that he got away with in that film, and this film was able to appeal to a youthful audience and an all around audience, and people really recognized the genius. It made it possible for him to continue on, and that's the Mel Brooks that we know. The Mel Brooks that we know has parodied. Part of the sad thing, though, is that he never really went back to straight comedy films until one time. He did Life Stinks in the mid '90s, I think, or maybe the late '80s. But everything up to that was a parody. He did a parody. He did a movie called Silent Movie, which is a parody, obviously, of silent films. High Anxiety, which is a parody of Hitchcock. History of the World, parody of biblical epics and large scale Hollywood epics. Spaceballs, Star Wars, and then he would end his career with Dracula Dead and Loving It. But he would also go on to recreate The Producers on stage, Young Frankenstein on stage. I think there were talks about doing Blazing Saddles on stage. He's an EGOT, Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony. He's won it all. He's one of the great. Not that any of that shit matters, but he is one of the great cinematic treasures, and he just keeps going. I mean, you hear less of him now, but the man is like 96, 97 years old. His wife has passed on. His best friend has gone. He's outlived everybody. So, sadly, we don't have a lot of time left with Mel Brooks. But my God, you want to talk about pushing the envelope and taking it to its logical conclusion and just beating it for everything that it was worth. That's Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks is one of the great comedy figures, but also one of the great cinematic figures. I mean, you can't beat what he did. So, I'm thrilled that I've gotten a chance to see these movies. That's me. That's my attitude.
Before we go,
Mm-hmm.
Gene Hackman. We can't.
You can't ignore it. This is what you would call slumming. Gene Hackman, Academy Award winner, already established for the French Connection a couple of years before. 71, right? 71?
One or two.
71, 72, somewhere around there. He had established himself. People wonder how the hell could Gene Hackman get in this movie? Why is Gene Hackman in this? Is that what are your thoughts? What are you wondering? What motivates you on this one?
It's just I remember when I first saw it and I said, "Is that Gene Hackman?" And then it's his, more than his face, it was his voice.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's interesting that, and I don't know the connection. I don't know how he would. I don't know how he wound up in that movie.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting to see him doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, anytime you see one of those people, well, the Robert Duvall's, the Gene Hackman, you can't not bring it up.
Well, the story is that Gene Hackman was tennis partners with Gene Wilder. And Hackman asked him, what are you working on? And he told him, and Gene Hackman thought it was a great idea. And he's like, is there anything in it for me? I've been wanting to try comedy. I've been wanting to do something a little bit less, serious. And he was like, well, yeah, we do. We have, there's The Blind Man. And Hackman knew the films. He knew Bride of Frankenstein, so he said, yeah, I'd love to do it. Hackman thought he was going to come in for a few hours and do this scene, or at least that's the way Mel Brooks tells it. Mel Brooks ended up keeping him there for 4 or 5 days, shooting that scene. And it's the scene itself has the danger of being of stopping everything cold, because it's like, oh shit, that's Gene Hackman, but you don't realize it's Gene Hackman. It's weird what those eyebrows and that beard and that long hair can do. You don't. For the longest time, I didn't know who it was. I didn't know it was a big deal. And that's basically what it was, is that Gene Hackman wanted... This is years before any of the comedy that he had done. And Gene Hackman only did a handful of comedies. Some of it bad, some of it good. But there's such a... It's such a frustrating scene. Not because it's a frustrating thing to watch, but you can... If you watch it from the perspective of the creature, as it's just trying to get a bite to eat, as it's just trying to connect with someone, and Brooks and Gene Wilder cannot allow it to be the sweet, soulful scene that was in the original film. They have to play up the ridiculousness of it, the clumsiness of it. And seeing Peter Boyle react in so many different ways, I just think it's hilarious. I think, he comes to the door and he's like, oh, you're a mute, a very big mute. He's touching his chest, But that final moment when that final moment when Peter Boyle goes crashing through the door, and Gene Hackman goes, where are you going? I was going to make espresso. That's such a ridiculous line. It's so stupid. The story is that they had to cut it immediately after that because the crew erupted into laughter, and every time they tried to do it again, Gene Hackman couldn't do the line again. He just kept laughing. I think it's hilarious. I think that's, it's... There's such a commitment to not only the story that's being told, but the story that has been told before it. So what you see is this is just gushing. This is just going off on praise for Mel Brooks and Boyle, Marty Feldman, Madeline Khan, Teri Garr, Leachman, and Kenneth Mars, and of course Gene Wilder, and now Gene Hackman, because it's everything hits. Every moment works for me. The jokes work for me. Damn your eyes. Nobody gets that. That's a British reference, but it the Abby Normal thing. It's fucking hilarious. Abby what? Abby Normal. And then this fucking game of charades. It's putting on the Ritz. People still talk about this film to this day, and I think if more kids were to see it, I think they would embrace it the way we did. Because when I saw it in the 80s. I was older. I didn't see it in 74. It was the year I was born. Young Frankenstein wasn't the first History of the World was the first Mel Brooks film that I saw. Then Blazing Saddles. Then Young Frankenstein. Then all the others, and Back to the Producers. And I was just, But when you find somebody who was that... What is the opposite of nuanced?
Obvious.
Is it obvious? I don't feel like obvious is the word.
But,
there is no nuance in these films. It's in your face. It's abrasive. It's Mel Brooks's filmmaking is obnoxious in many ways, and it works so beautifully for me. I really love his aesthetic. I really love his way of both looking at the world and looking at what film is and can do. This is a masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece for all of those involved. I love it.
Showiness.
Oh yeah, there is a showiness. There is a
it's I mean, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Show. I mean, his shit is about showiness, show business, show biz. You know,
Yeah.
and as an homage to the biz, to the horror biz.
Yeah.
It is ritzy.
I think it's for me it's one of the best films ever made. I think it hits that mark. I think it's something that sticks with you, that you want to go back to. I look forward to watching it again. I can't watch it as much as I used to, but it's comforting to know that it's there and that I can put it on and I can have a good laugh. And that's one of the things that movies provide us. An escape, a getting away from all the bullshit, a chance to just say, I want to laugh. And Mel Brooks delivered that in spades. So I salute Mr. Brooks, one of the greats, one of the funniest men to ever walk the earth. I'm done with what I want to say. Is there anything you want to leave the folks with?
We want to thank Stephen Palmer and everybody who's donating anonymously and monthly. Buy me a coffee /watch RickRamos. Buymeacoffee.com/watch RickRamos. You know the drill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to 2 months of horror. We appreciate you. Bye-bye now.